On November 21st, Nigeria's federal government ordered the immediate closure of 41 of its national colleges. Let's get into what that really means. Welcome to Africa Watch 360, calm, clear, and focused news you can trust. So, we're looking at a pretty major story developing in Nigeria. The federal government has just taken this really drastic step of shutting down 41 of its federally run high schools. They're known as Unity colleges. Now, according to circulars from the Ministry of Education, which were reported by outlets like AIT Live and The Punch, this isn't some random decision. It's a direct response to, and I'm quoting here, rising insecurity and the threat of student abductions. The order was for them to close immediately, which tells you just how serious the authorities believe this threat is. This move affects thousands of students, and, it raises some really critical questions about school safety in Nigeria. Okay, to really get the full picture here, we're going to break this down into 5 key parts. First, we'll cover the details of the shutdown itself. Then, we'll dive into the recent abductions that really seem to be the tipping point. After that, we'll zoom out and see how this fits into a much bigger nationwide pattern of school closures. From there, we'll analyze what this whole strategy tells us about Nigeria's security systems. And finally, we'll explore the ripple effects this has on education for everyone. Let's get started. Right, so let's start with the order itself. What exactly did the federal government say, and what was the official reason they gave for such a huge, sweeping decision? The number at the center of all of this is 41. And we have to be clear, this wasn't just a small, localized shutdown. This was a federally mandated order that affects schools in a whole bunch of different states. It's a coordinated, national-level response to what the government sees as a major threat to the country's schools. And to put that number, 41, into perspective, that's nearly 40% of all 104 federal Unity colleges in the entire country. These schools were actually set up to promote national unity by bringing students together from all different backgrounds. So closing almost half of them, it really underscores not only how severe the threat is perceived to be, but also how much this could disrupt a really key part of Nigeria's education system. The government's official reasoning is laid out pretty plainly in their own circular. It was signed by the Director of Senior Secondary Education, Binta Abdul-Kadir, and it doesn't leave much room for interpretation. It directly links the closures to, quote, recent security challenges. The whole thing is framed as a preventative move. So the key thing to take away here is that this wasn't some long-term policy change. It was an emergency response to what they saw as an immediate and present danger. Okay, so a decision this big doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It really seems to be a direct reaction to a string of violent attacks on schools that happened in the days right before this announcement was made. This timeline is absolutely crucial to understanding why this happened now. Just 5 days before the federal order, reports came out of Kebbi State that a girls' high school was attacked and 25 students were taken. Then, literally the day before the government's announcement, gunmen raided a private Catholic school in Niger State, abducting students and staff. The fact that these 2 major incidents happened so close together seems to have created a real sense of crisis, leading directly to this shutdown order. And when you look closer at these 2 attacks, you start to see a disturbing pattern. Both were direct assaults on schools. One was a public girls' school, the other a private Catholic school. According to reports from The Punch and the ICIR, the attack in Kebbi State specifically targeted female students. And the raid in Niger State, well, that was described as a coordinated attack early in the morning where they took both students and teachers. So taken together, these events just threw a harsh spotlight on how vulnerable all kinds of schools really are. Now, this federal action, as big as it is, it's not happening in isolation. It actually seems to be part of a much wider trend across the country where both federal and state governments are now using school closures as their main security tool. And like I said, this is not just a federal thing. As you can see here, reports from the ICIR show that around the same time, Plateau State went ahead and closed all its basic schools as a preventative action, and Katsina State shut down its public schools because of rising security concerns. What this tells us is that there's a consistent strategy emerging across different levels of government in Nigeria. When threats against schools go up, the go-to response, it seems, is to shut them down. So that brings us to the analysis part. What does this reactive strategy of just closing schools really mean? And what does it tell us about the state of Nigeria's security apparatus and its ability to protect students? Well, when closing schools becomes your main tool, it suggests you're on the defensive. To put it simply, instead of proactively going after the threats to make schools safe, the strategy is to just remove the targets, the students, from the school itself. And that's a really significant shift because it basically moves the responsibility for safety from the security forces onto the education system. So, based on the reporting we have, this whole situation raises a serious concern about sustainability. I mean, student safety is, of course, the number one priority, but relying on indefinite closures creates a really tough problem. How long can you just put education on pause? This strategy has definitely sparked a debate over whether this is a necessary life-saving measure or if it's actually a symptom of deeper problems in providing proactive security around schools. One way to interpret this is that the state is, in a way, admitting it just can't guarantee safety on school grounds right now. And the effect on everyday people is pretty obvious. For parents and students, it means their learning is completely disrupted, and it creates a lot of uncertainty and anxiety. For whole communities, it can start to wear away at their confidence in the government's basic ability to provide a safe place for kids to learn. And that public trust, that's absolutely essential for any government to function, especially on security. So, you might be asking, what are the alternatives to just closing everything down? Well, security analysts often talk about a multi-layered approach. As you can see here, that can mean things like physically fortifying school buildings and fences and having rapid response teams ready to go. It could also mean getting better at local intelligence gathering so you can spot threats early. And a third piece that's often mentioned is community-based policing, where local people become part of that security network protecting their own schools. Finally, let's just take a moment to look at the bigger picture here. What are the long-term ripple effects of this security strategy on Nigeria's education sector, on its students, and on its government? Well, the impact is different depending on who you are. For students, you have the immediate problem of a disrupted school year, but also the psychological weight of this constant threat. For parents, the situation can lead to a loss of trust, and it forces them to make some really tough choices about their kids' safety and future. And for the government, even though this is a protective measure, it also dials up the public pressure on them to find a more permanent solution, one that doesn't force a choice between education and security. So, a quick recap of where we're at. Nigeria's federal government has closed 41 Unity colleges. This was triggered by two recent, very serious school abductions. This move is part of a wider national pattern of states also using closures as a security tactic. And this whole reactive strategy is raising some big questions about the long-term plan for keeping schools safe in Nigeria. Looking ahead, this event is probably going to have several big consequences. For one, it's likely going to heat up the debate in Nigeria about who's ultimately responsible for school security, the federal government or the states. You can bet officials are going to face a ton of pressure to come up with a real, concrete national strategy for safe schools that goes beyond just closing them. And this whole crisis could very well shift future budgets and policies, maybe prioritizing things like security infrastructure for schools. And that leaves us with this central, very difficult question, and we'd really like to know what you think. When you're facing these kinds of direct threats against children, is shutting down schools a necessary evil? Is it the only responsible choice to save lives? Or is it an admission of a deeper systemic failure to protect the country's most vulnerable? This is very much a developing story. While keeping students safe is obviously the immediate goal, what the government does next is going to be absolutely critical. Whether they come out with a new security plan or just extend these closures, the next update could really change everything. We're going to keep a close eye on this. Make sure you stay subscribed for more clear, focused analysis from us here at Africa Watch 360. This analysis is based solely on information available from the credible sources referenced in this report. Details may change as more verified information becomes available.